So we should now be recording. Before I say anything else, I should note that unfortunately, Dr. Osorio had a family emergency, and so she will not be able to join us today, and our thoughts are with her and her family. I should also note that right now I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm on Occaneechi, Tuscarora, and Saponi peoples' land. And that UNCG is on the lands of the Kiawe and Sora peoples, and that many other peoples have also and continue to live on the lands occupied by UNCG and in Greensboro, including other Saponi peoples, Eastern Cherokee people, and Lumbee people. This presentation is sponsored by sorry, things keep popping up, so I'm sort of trying to sort of hit buttons as I'm talking to y'all. This presentation is part of the Linda Arnold Carlisle Professorship. I would very much like to thank Linda Carlisle and the Friends of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at UNCG for creating the professorship. Also thanking the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program and the English departments at UNCG for helping further fund the event. Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at UNCG was founded in 1972. It's one of the oldest such programs in the country, and we're currently celebrating our 50th anniversary. It has 3 degree programs. It has a bachelor's, master's, and graduate certificate program. So for those of you who are listening who are at UNCG, come and check it out. For those who are listening elsewhere, come and check it out. And also you can let your students know that they can receive an excellent education, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at UNCG. I would also like to thank Lisa Levenstein, Kelly Taylor, and Asa Eager for all of their help in putting together this event today. Today's presentation is the first in a 4-part series on new work in queer and trans studies. The second panel focused on Black studies will be on October 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And the other panels focused on Latinx studies and Asian American studies will be in the spring. So I'll introduce our speakers. They'll go in alphabetical order. So first Dr. Pierce, then Dr. Pyle, and then we'll open it up to question and answer. So Dr. Pierce, who is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, is associate professor at Stony Brook University and author of Argentine Intimacies, Queer Kinship in an Age of Splendor, 1890 to 1910. He's also co-editor of Políticas del Amor, Derechos Sexuales y Escrituras Disidentes en el Cono Sur, and co-editor of the 2021 special issue of GLQ, Queer Americas, Translation, Decoloniality, and the Incommensurable. Along with S.J. Norman, he is co-curator of the performance series, Knowledge of Wounds. Dr. Pyle is a Two-Spirit Michif and Sault Ste. Marie Anishinaabe researcher and writer, originally from Green Bay, Wisconsin. They are currently a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow in American Indian Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In addition to their scholarly and creative work on queer, trans, and Two-Spirit, Anishinaabe, and Michif history and art, they also have taught community classes in the Michif language and presently lead a weekly virtual Michif card game night for learners. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pierce.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation. So I'd like to express my gratitude. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna also pin myself. Is that right? Can you guys see me okay? Yes, okay, I'm just gonna keep going, okay. So the invitation that Mark extended asked about new work. And new work for me is often scary. And I feel at times self-conscious about sharing The new work, and this work is so new, I was scribbling in the margins this morning, trying to make it make more sense. So please let me know if something doesn't make sense, or if I can explain anything, or if you have any suggestions. So there's two parts to this. The first part is a story, and the second part talks a little bit more theoretically. Okay, so this is part one. I'm working on a new book about how contemporary Indigenous artists, knowledge keepers, and communities create and maintain relations. These relations are human and more than human, expanding across time and space, across struggles for Indigenous survivance, and the ongoing enactment of reciprocity that is at the heart of Indigenous life. Relations are both an epistemology, a form of knowing, and an ontology, a form of being. They expand beyond the material and toward the cosmic, beyond the present and toward iterative becomings that are neither past nor future, but both simultaneously. So I want to tell a story about the beginning of the world, so I can then talk about how this story provides a framework for thinking about relations and queerness, though also maybe not queerness. Here's the story. A long time ago, before people, before land, the earth was covered with water. The animals lived on Turtle's Back in Galunlati, the upper world. They were grateful, but they were starting to feel crowded. They worried that they were running out of room. So they held a council to decide if someone would volunteer to see what was below the water. Maybe there was room there, or maybe there was another place to live that they did not yet know about. The prospect of leaving Turtle's Back was daunting. They looked into each other's eyes and they were afraid. After a long silence, Dayunisi, the water beetle, Beaver's grandchild, said that they would see if they could learn what was out there beyond. Dayunisi was small, but brave. They leapt off Turtle's Back and landed on the water, held by its tension. They darted this way and that, dancing on the water, gliding across the waves. But they could not find a place to rest on the water's surface. They were tired, but they had to keep searching, so they dived down, down, down. Through the waves, through the purple-blue water as the light began to fade. It grew dark and cold, but they kept swimming. They had almost given up when, stretching out their hand, they touched something soft at the bottom of the great ocean. They grabbed a piece of mud, a speck of land, and turned. Up, 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 they swam. But they were so tired. They were running out of air. Just when it seemed hopeless, they began to see the light from above, and they thought of their kin, and they kept on swimming. Finally, they reached the surface and pushed through the waves, holding up the piece of mud for all to see. The other animals gasped with relief when they saw tiny Dayunisi emerge from the water. And when that speck of mud touched the air, it began to grow. It expanded in all directions, growing and spreading. It spread so much that it became the island that we now call Elohi, the earth, the middle world, Turtle Island. The animals thanked Dayunisi, and when the land had hardened, when Suli, the great vulture, had created the mountains and the valleys with his giant wings, when the rivers and streams began to flow, when the trees unfurled their green leaves to soak up the sun, the animals knew that they would survive. Turtle let them off his back and they started to live on Elohi. So in the Cherokee tradition, Dionysi dives into the primordial sea and returns with a small piece of mud that expands to create the world we now inhabit, Elohi, which is suspended between the above world, Galunlati, and the below world, Elati. Like most cosmogonies, this one demonstrates a fundamental truth. Life itself is the product of a reaching out, a search for something beyond the known, an extension toward the possible. Life is a gesture toward what could be. When I picture this story, I imagine that when Dionysi dives into the water, they generate capillary waves that break the cosmic silence, murmurings of a future yet to come. I can see how the waves we experience today are themselves the result of that vibrational opening, a kinetic disruption of time and space. I try to imagine what it felt like to dive beneath the surface of a limitless ocean. Sometimes I wonder if Dionysi hesitated when, as the light from above faded into a withering darkness, their task must have seemed impossible. What would it be like to endure, to reach out touching land when there was not yet such a thing as land? Dionysi's search for a solution to a community problem is predicated on a willingness to explore, but also to expose themselves to the possibility of failure. They are not just a character in this story, but a guide for acting in service of the greater good. What is more, we are the result of what Dionysi touched in that exact moment, when their hand grasped the basic matter of the world before it was possible to imagine it as such. A world in the process of creation, worlding. This story, indeed our existence, depends on Dionysi's reach toward the unknown. That gesture is a reminder of the promise of ancestral time opening into the future, a luminous glissando between worlds. This is part 2. I haven't said the word queer yet, not to fear. I wanted to begin with the beginning, but one that shows how the world was created by a tiny creature who we call water beetle, Dionysi, and that creature is not queer per se, but as I'll explain, anomalous. Queerness is not always queer for Indigenous people. The gender and sexual difference that has been attributed to indigeneity can only be queer from the perspective of settler sexuality. And we can thank Mark for helping us understand this. Of course, neither queerness nor queer studies are monolithic. Likewise, there is no singular form or understanding of indigeneity. And while the universalizing tendency of queer studies has been criticized in recent years, namely from queer of color critique, decolonial feminisms, and disability studies, the presumptive logic at the heart of queer studies transformations and adaptations is fundamentally incommensurable with the particular epistemologies and ontologies of Indigenous communities. The settler logic that persists is androcentric and atheistic. This logic does not serve the complexities of Indigenous relations. Our relations are not circumscribed to the human, the body, or erotic desire, though they do involve all three. Our relations are transtemporal, transcorporeal, spiritually engaged, historically contingent, and also, crucially, grounded in place. Thus, the sodomite, berdache, or two-spirit may be queer according to settlers, but they cannot be considered queer from within their own cultural paradigm because they are required for that paradigm to function. Their relations are essential. And I think one of the crucial distinctions we need to make regarding the possibility of thinking queerness and indigeneity together is the role that normativity has played in recent critical work. So I'm going to talk about normativity. Normativity is something we need to carefully define. for it is not the same thing to say that queerness constitutes the norm by being anti-normative, as it is to say that queerness and normativity are integral to each other's existence. At the risk of establishing a binary in order to dispel a binary, anti-normativity versus normativity only exists within a logic that requires the anti-normative exist in order for it to be destroyed. And here I would point to the work of Robin Weigman and Elizabeth Wilson, who edited a special issue of the journal Differences on this topic in 2015. However, the queer theory without anti-normativity debate overlooks the constitutive complementarity of indigenous cosmologies. But pointing out this oversight is not sufficient to understand what is lost by such a move. This is the difference between a settler ontology that requires an abject other to constitute the norm and an indigenous ontology that depends on contingent relationships moving in tension, in company, rather than as antagonistic opposites. So let me put this plainly. Normativity is a framework for understanding the power dynamics that govern social relations, but it is not a framework based in relationality. In contrast, and I should note from the beginning that I'm not the first person to point out, to turn to Daniel Heath Justice's work here on the anomalous, but I'm going to do that here. So in contrast, Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice has described as the anomalous those aspects of indigenous lifeways that do not exist only to be annihilated, but rather are themselves a creative force, a life-giving emergent possibility that explains that which exists outside the norm, but which is also necessary for the norm to function. In other words, this is the difference between basing a critique in opposition on the one hand, and on the other, basing a critique in relations and contingency. Justice's description of the anomalous situates Cherokee understandings of balance as a core epistemological principle. And I will attempt to push this further, or perhaps simply frame this discussion as part of a shift toward relations. But let me first trace a brief history of how normativity has emerged in Native American and Indigenous studies, so that I can return to the question of how contingency opens future possibilities for thinking across historical and epistemological contexts. So in his influential book, Red Skin, White Masks, Glenn Coulthard argues that grounded normativity refers to, quote, the modalities of indigenous land-connected practices and long-standing experiential knowledge that inform and structure our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others over time, end quote. In this definition, we find two related impulses. First, Coulthard foregrounds the politics and ethics of indigenous peoples as centered on and emerging from a communal engagement with the land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations. Second, Coulthard's understanding of normativity depends on time, which is to say on the accumulation of relational experiences rather than a linear historical progression, rather than, say, from savagery to civilization. So this is not a settler time, but an accumulation of experiences over time. There is a sense in this framing that normativity is what happens as the result of experience building on itself and coalescing into an ethics of relationality. It's important to note here that Coulthard's framing, framing of normativity is in dialogue with Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, and how Marx does not consider the dispossession of land rather than proletarianization to be the primary structure through which indigenous peoples are rendered antithetical to extractive capitalism. But there is nothing in this initial description that would suggest how that which exists outside the norm, which is to say the abject, the queer, the aberrant, informs the ethical engagements that the norm has accrued over time, and which through experience with the land has come to represent a form of living in relation with human and more than human kin. So I'm a bit hesitant to fully engage with this understanding of normativity. I'm a bit suspicious, I would say. A 2016 essay co-authored by Coulthard and Leanne Simpson expands on the core conceptual framework of grounded normativity to include specific understandings of decolonial praxis as an egalitarian method based on mutual recognition and respect. So this is what they write, and this is a long quote, so bear with me. What we are calling, this is Coulthard and Simpson. What we are calling grounded normativity refers to the ethical frameworks provided by these indigenous place-based practices and associated forms of knowledge. Grounded normativity houses and reproduces the practices and procedures based on deep reciprocity that are inherently informed by an intimate relationship to place. Grounded normativity teaches us how to live our lives in relation to other people and non-human life forms in a profoundly non-authoritarian, non-dominating, non-exploitative manner. Grounded normativity teaches us how to be in respectful diplomatic relationships with other indigenous and non-indigenous nations with whom we might share territorial responsibilities or common political or economic interests. Our relationship to the land itself generates the processes, practices, and knowledges that inform our political systems and through which we practice solidarity, end quote. Okay, the force of this articulation resides in its tactile presence. The adjectives paint the picture of how these relationships are enacted: grounded normativity, deep reciprocity, intimate relationships to place, territorial responsibilities, profoundly non-authoritarian. But these descriptors are also spatial. They orient the body in relation to land and to other human and non-human bodies. This spatializing of the methodological intervention reflects the impulse to be in relation, as in to describe the type of relation that is being enacted, as well as the grounding of method in the land itself. The land in its diverse manifestations and textures, in its own shaping of human movement across time and space. This co-written reflection informs how grounded normativity is taken up in Leanne Simpson's As We Have Always Done, where she writes, quote, "Grounded normativity is the base of our political systems, economy, and nationhood, and it creates process-centered modes of living that generate profoundly different conceptualizations of nationhood and governmentality, ones that aren't based on enclosure, authoritarian power, and hierarchy," end quote. So Simpson goes on to argue that the term itself, grounded normativity, is less important than understanding it as a mode of intelligence that allows us to ground our creative and erotic potential in indigenous modes of enactment, praxis, and care. However, normativity is not a term that is easy to dismiss or to accept in the context of queer studies. I don't know about you, but I really balked at normativity the first time I read it in the work noted above. And I'm not the only one, I think. Jody Bird, for example, traces these same conceptual difficulties in their article, "What's Normative Got to Do with It? Toward Indigenous Queer Relationality," published in Social Text in 2020. The article anticipates what I've been thinking of as the need to shift toward relations as a method of approaching queer studies and Indigenous studies together. Rather than grounded normativity, Bird proposes grounded relationality as a term that engages with the intersection of queer studies and existing understandings of Indigenous place-based practices of ethics, politics, and community. The grounds and the grounding of this relationality is not a universalizing claim, but rather, on the contrary, a specific engagement with place and context. So there are two things that I would like to add to Bird's argument. First, while the binary between norm and anti-norm clearly has no place in Indigenous epistemologies, the norm itself is still often left undefined. To my mind, Indigenous relations are contingent, dynamic interdependencies. They are not established by the taxonomic orderings of Western science, but rather the constellatory possibilities of mutual recognition, not in spite of, but because of difference. And in this, I would point to Cree scholar Karen Recollet's theorizing of constellations, the constellatory, so that combines kin and constellation. The second thing that I want to add is that grounded relationality is also a morphing, transitory, contingent set of engagements. And in this, I think there's an opening to imagining that relations are grounded in place while simultaneously they are engaged in speculation, becoming, transformation, and iteration. So now I'm moving to my conclusion. As I've already noted, my thinking here is influenced by an important critique of dissident corporealities by Daniel Justice. And Justice proposes the following. He writes, neither good nor evil, potentially helpful or harmful to established social categories and hierarchies, the anomalous body in pre and sometimes post-Christian Southeastern traditions represents profound powers and transformative possibility. By anomalous, Justice is referring to animals such as the bat and the flying fox, mammals that can fly, the bear who can walk on two legs like humans, or hybrid beings such as the flying snake, the ukten in Cherokee. The anomaly of these beings lies in their capacity to link worlds, bodies, and knowledge through the liminality of their existence or their multiplicity. And although Justice does not mention Dionysi, water beetle, in his text, water beetle is clearly an anomalous being. Their nature, and this is why I told the story at the beginning, their nature is that they are able to transit between worlds, water and earth, and even between the not yet here and the everything. In fact, I would suggest that Dionysi is the first being, and the first being that is characterized as anomalous. The Dionysi is the first example of transience, that is the transience that is necessary for the foundation of the world. Elohi, the world, it is worth repeating, emerges from the cosmic ocean because Dionysi was able to do what other beings could not, exist between worlds. The emergence of land depends on a being that has the capacity to transit between worlds, and in their transit, in their gliding between above and below, between nothingness and everything, resides the power of our bodies, also anomalous, inexorable in their quotidian mutability, in their becoming. If this is how the world was born, then let us imagine that Dionysi is a model for we who traverse spheres of gender, desire, or simply life, a model at the center of everything at the crucial moment when all that exists begins to be what it was meant to be and what it will become. We could even say that living between worlds is Dionysi's norm. This leads to a simple conclusion. If this is how the world was born, then anomaly is required for the world to exist. It is the spark that ignites life. Dionysi's reach their turn underwater instantiates a process that does not obey normative temporality, neither cis nor hetero nor capitalist nor patriarchal, but is itself a becoming world that characterizes this sacred story. And thus I want to propose Dionysi is an ancestral guide for those of us who refuse colonial gender norms, who in our bodies, desires, dreams, and in-betweens also generate worlds. If the origin of everything is the result of an anomaly, of a being that can transit between, liminal transience should have a privileged place in the politics as well as in the culture of our communities. If there is something that this sacred story of Cherokee origins teaches us, it is that creation itself is the inescapable product of a continuity, a gesture, a becoming. We bear witness to this constant transformation, this fleeting, luminous process of creation. And finally, we see that Dionysi is a non-binary ancestor, liminal, humble, and at the same time, essential for the creation of the world we inhabit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pierce. And now we turn to Dr. Pyle.
Hi, everybody. Give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint slides. Okay, can folks see that? Can someone give me a signal? Thank you. Okay, great. Before I officially get started, I want to say Kichimarsi Miigwech. Thank you to Mark for this invitation and to Joseph for sharing this space with me and sharing your words. I am going to be mostly talking about Anishinaabe things today, but I do want to just like put an acknowledgement to say, well, first to say, I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from my homelands, which is a thing I've never gotten to say before. I'm in Brandon, Manitoba, which is part of the Métis homeland. Literally, I'm in a Michif immersion house today, so I'm very excited to be speaking to you from the English-only closet of the house. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is, like Joseph said about his work, I'm sharing some very new things. I'm going to give a very brief, rapid overview of kind of what I've been doing so far with my research, and then share 3 examples with you that have like blown my mind and changed how I have been thinking about queer, trans, and two-spirit Indigenous, and especially Anishinaabe experiences and thought, I guess. So yeah, with that said, I'll get started. So I'm going to introduce myself in Anishinaabe one first. So bonjour, mekidepenes Indigenous, megizin dodem, wejashwi kwigmagin donjaba, Champaign, Illinois, da shinda nongum, bawating minoa misquagami weziping onjabawa gendana kupijinaganak, ni jojichag indeyawag. So I start with a formal introduction of myself and my language, Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. I'll be referring to it as both of those terms. So the usual form of introduction in Anishinaabe contains essential information about who I am and how we might relate to each other, especially if you're an Anishinaabe person yourself. So it has my name, my clan, my birthplace and current home, my ancestral communities, and one more thing. So introductions typically end with a statement, Anishinaabe Ndao or Anishinaabe Kwe Ndao, which means I am an Anishinaabe man or I am an Anishinaabe woman. And as a person who is neither a man or a woman, for a very long time, this part of the introduction was something I struggled with. And today, thanks to a lot of my research and both in archives and in oral tradition with elders, I am able to finish my greeting by saying Nijo Jichag and Dayawag, which means I am a two-spirit person. And so as a two-spirit and transgender person, this desire to find presences and words for people like me in historical records and in oral tradition, it hasn't been just like an idle curiosity for me, but a vital necessity for my continued participation in Indigenous cultural spheres. I have always the questions of, what do I call myself in my language when I'm speaking to other people? What history can I draw on to help my community members understand who I am, especially when talking to elders who speak our languages? These questions face like pretty much every two-spirit person who's involved with linguistic and cultural revitalization movements. And the introduction speech was one of the first places where I realized how important those questions were. Although from a non-Indigenous perspective, it might seem like an individual assertion of identity, the final statement about being an Anishinaabe man, woman, or two-spirit person is actually far more deeply tied to questions of how other people will relate to me on hearing my introductions. So in some ways, the example of sharing your pronouns in an introduction in English offers a small analogy. Although you're sharing something that is based on your identity, the reason we share pronouns is generally because we are asking others to relate to us in a certain way by using those pronouns to refer to us. But compared to the speech level action of pronoun usage, asserting myself as an Anishinaabe man, woman, or two-spirit person places me within a web of gendered relations of kinship, social practices, and spiritual roles. So the final statement of the introduction is a way to link yourself to thousands of years of always shifting but still continuous relationships among variously gendered beings. And while certainly as a two-spirit person, I am always aware that roles are not necessarily determined by gender, calling yourself an Anishinaabe man, woman, or two-spirit person gives the listener a sense that this person is someone who I could or could not call Niji, which is a term for friend or sibling. That person is someone who might lay the cedar trail or tend the grandfather or grandmother stones at a sweat lodge. Or another person might be able to gather wild rice with wooden knockers, would stand and pull the boat, or would be able to jig the rice to remove the hulls later. I started learning Ojibwe for real in 2015. I've been learning my other language, Michif, since I was a teenager, basically, but I had picked up some Ojibwe because a number of Michif speaking elders also speak Ojibwe, but I didn't really focus on it until then, in part because I was fairly disconnected from my Ojibwe side of the family until that time. But in 2016, I moved to Minneapolis and started graduate school at the University of Minnesota, which I chose in part because it has a really amazing Ojibwe language program. So I was taking classes at the university, attending language tables. There's a number of language tables in Minneapolis. For a while, they were happening like 3 times a week. And I got involved with a few other programs on the Fond du Lac Reservation in northern Minnesota. When I applied to grad school, I didn't actually think I was going to write my dissertation on anything related to gender or sexuality or two-spiritness. But after a while, this pattern emerged in my work where all my classes, I ended up writing papers about Indigenous feminism and just like gender and sexuality in Indigenous contexts in general. And at the same time, I was learning more and more Ojibwe language alongside Korean Michif, which are very closely related languages. So in 2017, when I got a summer fellowship, I decided to research words for gender and sexuality gender and sexual diversity in those 3 languages. Because I would ask people that I met in the language revitalization community, like, do you know any words for this? And most of the time I got the answer, no, not really. A few people had heard this one particular word, agokwe, because it was recorded in a very widely read document that a lot of Ojibwe people are familiar with, but they weren't really sure if they were saying it right or what it really meant. So it was kind of a mystery. And so I started to go through all the sources that I could find that might have words for Two-Spirit people in them. I looked at dictionaries from the 1800s that were put together by missionaries. I looked at fur trade journals of people who might have met what we call Two-Spirit people. I also looked at ethnographies from the early 20th century because a lot of those anthropologists were really interested in what they called berdashes, which is what they borrowed from French fur traders as a term for Native people who were mostly perceived as people assigned male at birth, but who lived as women or in mixed gender roles, to give a very brief summary of that. I also did a lot of learning from oral history work from folks like Anton Troyer, who has some work on Ojibwe oral history on this, and Chelsea Vowell with Plains Cree. I even looked at the Ojibwe and Cree medical dictionaries, which some elders in Northern Ontario put out because it had words for homosexual in them. And what I learned from all of this was that although some people have claimed that, oh, we didn't have words for that in our language, at least for Anishinaabe, and Michif and Cree, we actually had a lot of words. So this is just like a small sample of like some of the words that I have found in various sources in Ojibwe, Cree, and Michif. And the colors are not, they don't equal the different languages. It's just like, I just put this into a little pretty word cloud generator. So it's just to look nice. So I'm starting with this really long intro about how I got to my doctoral research because I want to start by asserting that yes, there is value for queer and trans Indigenous people to look at historical records. It's a fraught journey, but there are definitely things that are fascinating, eye-opening, and inspirational fodder for our present day work of reclaiming our places in the circle. There are also many historical figures we might call queer, trans, or two-spirit in archival material that have not had their stories shared widely yet. In my dissertation, I wrote about 3 figures from the long 19th century, you might say, that literally all 3 of them I found in footnotes in academic and historical work. And then I just followed the sort of trails, and turns out there was a lot of really interesting information. But I also ran up against some blocks. There's kind of a limit to what the historical record can do to some extent, because in this case, it's overwhelmingly recorded by colonial sources. So there are just some things that are not going to show up in the archives that you know must have been there. There are things that are just like written about in a way that you don't, like if it's a person, you know, you're not getting you don't get the perspective all the time or hardly ever of the perspective of the two-spirit person in question, like from their interior sense of self, or even their community sense of who they are. So there are these like blocks that I was struggling with. And so what I'm going to do now is to just share these 3 examples to kind of show the newer strategies I've been taking for exploring ways to talk about gender and sexuality in Anishinaabe contexts. And it kind of involves a bigger picture form of thinking than my initial approach of what are words for two-spirit people, in ways that like look analogous to LGBTQ identities in English. There's a really wonderful couple of sentences in queer Ganyangehaga scholar Marie Lang's recent book on two-spirit youth. And these are actually also hidden in a footnote, or not hidden, I guess, but they're in a footnote. It's a great footnote. She asks these 2 questions that I really love. So the first one is, how do our languages hold space for difference? And how can we build on the inherent flexibility of our languages? And the second question is, what does the Great Law of Peace have to say about transphobia? And so if you are not familiar, the Great Law of Peace is the law that holds together the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and serves as their constitution. And so ever since I read this question, I've been really fascinated by what it kind of opens up. And because I'm not Ganyangehaga or Haudenosaunee, I can't speak to the answers to this specific question about the Great Law of Peace. but the idea behind it, and the first question about our language is flexibility, is essentially how can we return to our nation's original teachings or original instructions, as some people call them, and learn things from them about our lives and the lives of our kin as queer and trans and two-spirit people. It may seem at first glance like our most well-known laws and teachings don't specifically speak to queer, trans, and two-spirit people, in the sense that there are rarely things explicitly saying, thou shalt not misgender a trans person, which, you know, in Anishinaabe culture, we don't really have thou shalt not as a entire concept. But there may not even be stories of what are recognizable to us today as two-spirit figures. But these three examples are kind of like where I'm finding inspiration. And there's a lot of detail that could go into each of these. So I'm just kind of like providing a few questions that each of them raises for me. So the first one is this poster that was created by the Native Youth Sexual Health Network many years ago now. It was part of a series of images of two-spirit people encouraging Native community members to embrace us and challenge homophobia and transphobia. So we have this image of a person with the statement, my two-spirit teachings include ... and in reference to the words that are tattooed on this person's back. And those words are actually what are commonly known in Anishinaabe communities as the Nijwaswegikinomadewinan, or the 7 teachings. And in English, they're usually referred to as the 7 grandfather teachings, and sometimes the 7 grandmother teachings. But in the language, they don't have a gender, it's just the 7 teachings. And what they are is Nibwakawin, Dbadendiswin, Zag Edwin, Akdeewin, Wekwadzuin, Debwewin, Mnadendawin. And each of them contains a lot of like really deep philosophical meaning. But just to give really rough translations, they're usually spoken of as meaning wisdom, humility, love, courage or bravery, honesty or doing the right thing, truth, and respect. So ever since I saw this poster, it's stuck with me for the way that the person in the photo, who I don't know their name or their pronouns, but this person is asserting them as specifically two-spirit teachings, not as grandfather teachings centering elder men, or even reclaiming them as being grandmother teachings for women, but explicitly stating that these are also teachings for two-spirit people. The poster asks us Anishinaabe to consider, what do these teachings that many of us have heard 1,000 times mean for two-spirit people? What does it mean to have Akdeewin as a two-spirit person, to be brave, to speak or live Debwewin, truth, to embrace Dag Edwin, love? It asks us to consider what unique perspectives two-spirit people might bring to these topics. And I think it also challenges non-two-spirit Anishinaabe to think about whether their actions towards two-spirit kin are in alignment with these teachings that we all hold dear. The second image that I am sharing is this photo that my friend Sakehituin Oasis took at a very large gathering for the water of the Great Lakes that took place at Garden River First Nations a few years ago near my ancestral territory of Bawating, Sault Ste. Marie. I wasn't personally able to attend, but I heard a lot about it from friends. And I learned that it was significant in part because in addition to having an elders tent, a youth tent, and tents for men and women, there was also a specific ceremonial space for two-spirit people, which is what this image is of. The flags on the tent read in glittery blue ink, gender is fluid like Nibi, and Nibi is the Ojibwe word for water. So that's like the thing that kind of blew my mind when I saw it, which is that for Anishinaabe people, water is something that's typically spoken of as a responsibility of women. It's why women have been the leaders of water walks around the Great Lakes and elsewhere. There are other ceremonial duties related to water that women hold. But to see the idea of Nibi, water, as connected to fluidity of gender was something that was totally new for me, which is interesting because I had heard the phrase, you know, gender is fluid in non-Indigenous contexts many, many times. But I had never thought about the literal liquid meanings of fluidity. And my friend Yaz M. Morgan wrote an amazing piece that's called "My Pronouns Are Key Kin," which kind of thinks about this teaching, which they learned from another friend of both of ours, whose name is Erin Consmo. And in it, they speak about learning of the possibilities of genderless water, which also recognizing that they don't want to take away from the relationship between women and water in our culture, but that it's possible for more than one gender to hold relationships with Nibi. And I think that by having a ceremonial space for Two-Spirit people like the water gathering did, both literally, physically a space, and by also the space of connecting ideas of gender fluidity with Anishinaabe teachings, is one way to start exploring that possibility. The last image I'm showing you is this photo or image by Anishinaabe Métis filmmaker and artist Fallon Simard. So the image is just the background. The sort of text and stuff on there is from something else, which I'll talk about in a second. So the image is connected to his short film Prayers for Dreamy Boys, which has a bunch of images of red cloth covered in cedar boughs with blueberries and water lilies moving over the top, while sounds of wind and water and birds play over the background. According to the description, the film and images were Fallon's way of imagining alternative forms of trans masculinities with healing objects and beings from Anishinaabe culture. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the film itself because I've talked to Fallon and he doesn't really want the film to be analyzed academically at this point. So I'm just going to point to one thing as a jumping off sort of aspect that inspired me to find some more awesome things, which is the water lilies. So I was really struck by the water lilies when I watched the film because I realized I didn't actually know any teachings or stories about water lilies in Anishinaabe culture. So I went looking for some and I learned a couple of different versions of the story of how the water lily came into existence. And the one that really struck me was a version written down in 1850 by a famous Mississauga Anishinaabe writer named Gagigegabo, or more commonly known as George Copway. And in his version, the Anishinaabe see a star that seems to fall halfway down the sky and then stop. That night, a young man has a dream where a woman appears to him and tells him that she is the star and she's fallen in love with humanity and wishes to dwell among them. She then asks him, "What shape should I take?" So the young man wakes up and informs the council members of his community about his dream and the star's question, and they respond that they would be so grateful for her to live among them that she should choose whatever shape she likes and wherever she wants to live. So she tries out a few shapes and places. She starts off as a white rose on a mountain, then she's a wildflower on the prairie, but ultimately she chooses to become a white lily dwelling on the water. And I was really taken with this story as a trans person. When I read it, I had been thinking about the quotes from Marie Lang and the poster from Nishin, and I was trying to figure out how I might look for Two-Spirit teachings beyond the obvious places that are really like kind of drawing analogies to white LGBTQ identities. And what really stuck out to me here was the way that the star woman asks what shape she should take. And the wise people tell her, "Please choose your own shape. We are happy to have you, whatever way you please." And then not only that, but she actually tries out a few different shapes before settling on what she finds to be best for herself. And traditionally for Anishinaabe storytellers, they try not to like hammer home a didactic point. It's really more like intended that we just like kind of sit with the story and draw our own conclusions about it. So I'm just going to let you think on that and how it potentially resonated with me as someone who has altered my body in various ways and taken on different roles in my life. I don't actually even know if Fallon Simard knows the story or was intentionally referencing it. I haven't had a chance to ask him, but I deeply cherish this story already in this version for the possibilities it offers as a Two-Spirit story. So to conclude, I mainly want to emphasize that in the process of coming back into the circle, which is a term that Cree scholar Alex Wilson uses to refer to the process that Two-Spirit people go through in reclaiming sort of community-based relationships and places for ourselves to thrive. There are many resources available to us as queer and trans Indigenous people. Historical and linguistic documentation is valuable and is often much richer than we expect, but there are also other ways to approach this question beyond digging through archives. These methods might be described as trying to address queer and trans Indigenous experience through culturally specific lenses. Just because a story doesn't explicitly mention trans or queer sexuality or gender doesn't mean it has nothing to say about queer and trans Indigenous life. So more than anything, I hope that perhaps the examples I have shared today may spark inspiration for other Two-Spirit people and other folks to think about creative ways that we can reclaim our places in the circle of our communities. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pyle. So now open it up to questions. I'm just changing the view on my computer. So if folks wanted to raise hands, if you wanted to actually voice your question, you could do that. So you can either put it in the chat for everyone, or you could raise your hand at, the raise hand function on Zoom, and then, give voice to it. While folks are thinking, I'm wondering, Doctors Pierce and Pyle, if you have any questions for each other.
I have a question. Kai, I really appreciate the care with which you describe returning to an archive that is actually a very violent space, because it's a space of historically fixing and of taxonomical ordering and of literal violence as well. And so I wonder if you could describe a little bit more about going to those painful or violent spaces like the archive, imagining the archive as a very challenging and fraught space for us, not just because of the lack, but because of the specific forms of violence that it enacts. Because I found this, myself, like a lot of my early work is about 19th century, things. And so I'm very much an archival person. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the affect of the archive.
Yeah, thank you. That's, yeah, it is a very emotional experience to read and find those stories. In particular, two of the people that I studied and wrote about in my dissertation are described in very derogatory ways in the archive. One person is written about by sort of a fur trade era individual, and he just straight up refers to this person as just a disgusting creature. And yet, and the other example that I was going to give is an individual who Ralph Carwinio was his name, who literally the records we have about him are because he was arrested for quote unquote cross-dressing in the early 20th century. And so just the very fact that we know about him is from an inherently violent process. And I guess what I've been, my way of sort of trying to handle that, I guess, is I know the phrase reading against the grain is very, very, very overused at this point, but sometimes it really is about for me, I think what it's about is the contextual knowledge that I have as someone who knows a lot about Anishinaabe culture and history. So for the first person I was talking about, Ozawandib, in this fur trade era instance, there's a story that I like to tell, which comes from this source where the man is there's this Two-Spirit person, Ozawandib, who is pursuing John Tanner as a husband. And he's oh, she's disgusting, whatever. And then he says one day she pointed out a moose to me in the woods, and she was like, hey, it's a moose. So I shot at it and totally missed. And literally the next line in this source is like, the next day we found another camp and she married this other guy. And I was like, okay, but you just totally failed her test to see if you were going to be like a good provider for her as like an Anishinaabe two-spirit woman. And so like, I just think of that always as an example of like how you can kind of read between the lines and find those stories, even when they're being described in the archive in very painful ways. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Because one of the things that I hear, Kai, and what you're saying is that, as Joseph was noting, there's certainly moments of violence and horror. There are also moments of kind of delight and joy, right? If you can read for them, if you refuse to presume that Native people's lives, even in Euro-American archival records, that Native people's lives are simply tragic, right? That you can then see, right, the ongoingness, right, of life in them, especially if one is, as you noted, that not all the stories are going to be explicitly noting something, you know, queer or trans. However, if you sort of know what you're looking for, or can begin to develop a sense of what you're looking for, then you can see other possibilities, right, for living and making life, even amid colonial violence, right, in the archive.
Yeah, and I think like when I wrote about those 3 individuals in my dissertation, like I didn't even realize what I was seeing until someone else kind of pointed it out to me. So originally I was like, I'm going to write about the way that land theft shaped these 3 individuals' lives as two-spirit people in the long 19th century. And so I wrote this whole chapter about them. And one of my advisors was like, you know, I feel like this is not the story you're telling. It seems like, and she said to me, like, the thing I'm seeing is that you're describing these people's pursuit of their own like joy was like what you're seeing. And I was like, can I write about that? Which is like a whole other thing, is like feeling like you can't write about Indigenous like joy in the archive, which I know joy is also like a very tense kind of concept for people to use, but like, yeah, sometimes you are so trained to see the pain in the archive that you don't notice those moments of joy.
And just to reiterate for folks, if you would like to offer a question or comment, please feel free to do so in the chat, or to raise your hand while folks are thinking and perhaps formulating such questions and comments. I have a question both for one for Joseph and one for Kai. For Joseph, so I understand the raising questions around the idea of the normative, right? As you note, you think about the constellary possibilities of mutual recognition based on difference, right, within Indigenous philosophies and cosmogonies. And so there's a problem with the notion of the norm or the normative kind of as a frame. And you talk about grounded relationality as contingent and morphing and transformative, and transience that's necessary for the formation of the world, using the example of the water beetle. And so if normative as a term has the sense of a sort of ironclad model, which doesn't fit with what you're trying to say about contingent modes, right, of relation, I'm also wondering, thinking to Kai's talk about something like the 7 teachings, right, which provide a kind of set of principles, right, for Anishinaabe people to speak with each other about what constitutes moral action, ethical action, possibilities for governance. So I'm also wondering then how to talk about when there are disagreements over what's to be done, right, and especially disagreements pressurized by ongoing colonialism, how to talk about the citation of principles, right, that could guide action, especially when there's disagreement over right, how to move forward or disagreement with regard to forms of governance. And then, Kai, I'm wondering if, because you talked about the value of turning back to native languages and the richness, right, of native languages, and cited Lang's point about the potential capaciousness of native languages with regard to gender, sexuality, various kind of modes of being. And you'd also talked about the value of turning to the archives and to seeing forms of historical presence which are not prevalent within, right, existing, especially dominant historical narratives. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sort of what you might describe as sort of two-spirit method, right, in the work that you're engaged in. Again, those are certainly part of it, but if you could sort of talk a little bit more about how you're coming to understand sort of methods for two-spirit analytical work, especially in the kind of history that you're interested in telling. So whoever would like to go first.
I mean, there's something, thank you for that question, Mark. I think one of the things that I would like to maybe clarify is, I think that across queer studies, we don't actually understand what normativity means. There has been a consistent lack of interrogation about what we mean by that. And so then, if that is the case, or because that is the case, I think that grounded normativity, while I understand and agree with a lot of what it's saying, I think runs the risk of reframing contingency as normativity, which are not the same things. And in fact, in most of my early work, I've actually tried to show that normativity is contingent, right? The norms are constantly shifting, and normativity is constantly co-opting, and it's constantly expanding and contracting. It's not actually a set, standard, continuous thing. This is why the family, the understanding of the family, is always changing. Now, if and so I don't for me it's not so much about whether or not we use grounded normativity or grounded relationality, so much as are we framing our discussion of gender and sexuality from within Indigenous perspectives that allow for and center contingency, relationality, mutability, transformation, liminality, as opposed to the kind of structured ordering of bodies that exists in Western epistemologies. I don't know. I just think that normativity is also a Western concept, and one that doesn't actually serve us very well historically. And then so finally, the citation of principles rather than norms, I like that because it actually asks you to be in dialogue with other people in order to work out what the norm is. So that's actually more in keeping with an Indigenous form of doing things than it would be to say, what is the law? And even in the case of, for example, like Cherokee blood law or blood law, which a lot of people have sort of described as kind of a vindictive or a revenge cycle. It's not actually about revenge so much as it is restoring balance to the world. And in that sense, it's about returning to a sense of order, but that has to be negotiated through these types of contingencies. The world is out of order and it has to be put back into order. But that order is not always fixed. It's actually always susceptible to change. And so that's where I think we have an opening for queer, trans, two-spirit people, it is to say that that contingency, because so many of our epistemologies are actually founded on contingency, we are the ones who actually live and experience and embody that contingency on a daily basis, and therefore like have the bodily experience of that. That's kind of what I was getting at with my reading of Water Beetle.
I think in response to your question, Mark, I always struggle with questions about method, to be honest. I have a very hard time, like, I was trained in Indigenous studies and American studies, and neither of those are, they're like very like, we're gonna pluck from whatever methods we find useful. But I think maybe one story that might illuminate a little bit of how I am thinking about doing this work with archival and language work is a story that I've told, I think, a lot, but about finding, so I attended this language camp, this immersion camp in northern Minnesota. We had a whole weekend with 3 elders. One of the elders was Mani Shikabi, who's a two-spirit elder from Canada. And she told us like a whole bunch of stuff in the language about her life. And then the other 2 elders who were there, though, from Minnesota, they started talking to each other about, you know, do you remember, like, did we have words for folks like this? And one of the words that they remembered was a word called Eyekwe. And at the time I was like, okay, Eyekwe. I'm just like writing this down, trying to get all of the words. It sounded a little familiar, but I wasn't sure why. And then later I was doing archival research, and I was, strangely enough, looking at translations of the Bible, because there's a verse in the Bible that refers to eunuchs. And I wanted to see how the 19th century translators had rendered this into Anishinaabe. And I found they used the exact same, they used that word. So in I think the first one is from 1840 something. And then there's another one a decade later, and they both use this term Eyekwe. That was the same word that I heard from these elders in 2017. And like, I guess for some folks that might not seem like especially like amazing, because some people have language records that are like very extensive historically, but for Anishinaabe people, it's like, this was for me a sign that our elders still recognize a form of kinship in the language between two-spirit people today when they were growing up, and these people who lived in the 1840s. So even though maybe what an Eyekwe specifically looks like and does may be different, there's like that kinship that is recognized by speakers of the language. And so I gave that like a fancy name of transtemporal kinship, which is like, that's my thing or whatever. But that is kind of like the method that I have been like focusing on, is the way that two-spirit people have and our communities like draw on these historical memories, but maybe not always in the way that we expect. They may be like, there's change that happens, there's like transformation, there's just like creativity, but there's always like that recognition of relation between us, the ancestors, and our descendants.
And so we have about 15 minutes left on our allotted time. So just reminding folks again, and someone just put something into the chat. This is Tiffany King. Kai, as you attend to language and linguistics, do you pay attention to how things sound, i.e. inflection, tonal differences, or shift, volume? Are there moments, places, and context when the ways words are pronounced and sound change, the way gender is invoked, imagined, or understood? Is there a sonic register that is useful?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you, Tiffany. So the first thing that came to my mind is that there's this word that some folks I know have used, which is for like Two-Spirit folks, which is ikwekazo or inanikazo, which is a word that literally, if you just translate it, it means like pretends to be a man or pretends to be a woman. And so when I first learned that, I actually read it in a book that someone had done this oral history work, and it was like, this is what the elder told me is how you say this word for like lesbian or gay or whatever. And I was like, ooh, I don't know if I like that. But then I started, when I was like actually having conversations with elders and with other learners who are engaged with these works, I learned that like there's like a I don't know how to put it. Like, even though its literal translation may sound bad, when people use it, if they're using it in a respectful way, it doesn't necessarily feel the same way, the same kind of connotation of like pretending the way that people talk about trans people in English, for example. So that is kind of one of the things that came to my mind when I read your question.
And we have another question in the chat. This is from Liz Ellis, who thanks both Joseph and Kai for their wonderful talks. This is a question for Kai. Liz says, your work is amazing and so important for early historians who have overlooked or rejected these stories of non-binary Indigenous people. So first, this is awesome, and I can't wait to read and hear more. Can you talk at a very broad level about how returning queer and non-binary Indigenous folks to these early stories of Anishinaabeg power in the Great Lakes and to subsequent stories of exchange with Europeans might change the ways that we think about colonial encounters? I'm thinking here of how your work might reshape an intro-level course in Native history, for example.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. I have definitely thought about this. I'm working on a expanded version of that chapter of my dissertation right now, looking specifically at Ozawandib from the fur and how Ozawandib changes the way we think about the fur trade era. I also, if you're interested, I recorded an episode with this Canadian group of folks about the source, John Tanner, and how he talks about it. That's intended for teachers. So I can send you that if you like. But Ozawandib's story is interesting because I think knowing that she was a warrior, that she was also like her sort of pursuit of John Tanner as a husband. And John Tanner, for those who don't know, was a white Kentuckian who in the late 1700s was captured at like age 8 and then lived the rest of his life as an Anishinaabe person, essentially. So I think like reading that story that I told about the moose, for example, for me, it's like we talk a lot about like intermarriage in the fur trade era, of like Indigenous women and white men. And I think that like knowing like Ozawandib as like a trans feminine or two-spirit person was like also engaged in these relationships is something that we don't often think about. I think the fact that she was engaged in warfare as a trans feminine two-spirit person is something that like is totally not how people talk about gender and like warriorhood in Native communities in early America. So yeah, I think there's like a lot I think there's a lot that these stories both can sort of reinforce and like, but also alter the way that we're thinking about those time periods. Yeah, and the sources are really great to read. Like some of them, like Ozawa and Dips, is it's painful to read because the way he describes her is so rude. But when you like really dig into it and, like I said, read kind of between the lines and with the context from Anishinaabe culture, it opens like a larger story that is very interesting.
Also, it seems to me, with regard to that same question, Joseph, thinking through your presentation, that when you talk about the water beetle and the water beetle's work in building Turtle Island, making possible Turtle Island, you say life is a gesture toward what could be. And also at the end of your talk, noting the transience, right? So the water beetle is a sort of in between, a figure that's in between worlds, the transience that's necessary for the formation of the world. It seems to me then in thinking about something like Colonial Encounter, right? That to then take those stories and to think about them through the kind of transanalytic, right, that you're thinking about them, that they offer philosophical resources for re-narrating kind of what those encounters are and how they work, as opposed to a kind of teleology toward conquest, or the assumed, right, unfolding of, you know, kind of Euro-American power, but a different kind of contingency. I'm wondering if that sort of speaks to you, if you might speak to that.
I mean, there's a, you know, in the rest of the book that I'm working on, one of the terms that came out in the introduction that I pick up later is gesture. And there's a chapter that I have on late 19th and early 20th century photographs, ethnographic photographs of indigenous people in Argentina, in the north of Argentina, and in the south, and trying to find within the colonial frame, right, the ethnographic frame, methods of reading that I call gestural resistance. And it's not to say that we can construct a context around the photograph through which, you know, because some people have written about, yes, there is some agency of people who are sitting for photographs. Yes, this is true. But from within the formal requirements of the photograph, there is also a way that, for example, one of the subjects will be squirming and thus blurring the image. So how can we read that gesture, which is a blur, which is a moment that disrupts the stillness that is expected of the sitter for the photograph? And so I call those gestural moments of gestural resistance. I think Dionysi is also an example of gestural resistance, but it's a gesture, the grabbing and the turning, that allows us to say that the methods that we have of reading back into time is a kind of deliberate anachronicity, but one that is actually more in keeping with indigenous understandings of time, which see time as overlapping and as, you know, multiple. And so I don't actually care if I'm being like presentist or atemporal in these readings, because my intent actually is to enliven the subjects whom history has consistently framed as still, as captured, as kind of registered through the colonial gaze as such. And so that's one of the things that I'm trying to do throughout the sort of arc of the book. And that, to me, is what I'm calling speculative. So that is the kind of gesture that I'm trying to make, is that speculating, not in the economic sense, but speculative relations then is a way of us kind of is making transtemporal kinship. I think it's very similar to that, in that it allows me to say, I'm not interested in simply reviving or reconstructing the history around this person, but actively enlivening them so that we can still be with them today. That's not the same thing. And so I think that's what I'm trying to do in the big picture with the book, and the gesture is the thing that kind of made it click for me around that.
So we're almost at time, but there were two other questions that were posed, so I'll read them out and see if Kai and Joseph, if you have some quick responses. Kelton Hollister had said, thank you both for sharing and your wonderful work with us. Dr. Pyle, I wondered if you have encountered anything either in contemporary or historic accounts, specifically regarding intersex people in the lexicon or lexicons. If so, does it differ or correspond with existing terminology regarding two-spirit people? And what do you think the significance of these similarities or differences might be? And then Lane McLean Rowe, it said, thank you both. Joseph, would you be willing to speak more on the relationship between transness and transience, both in physical space and temporality? And Joseph, you were just talking about this a little bit, but if you have anything further to add, and then after those responses, we'll close there.
I'll just take that up, and then Kai, we can end with you, since it's a bit more of a substantial question there. I think, transness and transience, I don't know that I make it explicit, but I think that the method, and I think I should make this explicit actually, is that the method that I'm intuiting here is actually closer to trans studies than it is to queer studies. And I don't, again, like, I'm trained in queer studies, like that's my thing, but it doesn't seem to be serving the project that I'm trying to work on. And so transience and transness, I think if we're talking about, for me, privileging liminality and the crossingness, the ability to transit across realms as actually the core gesture that allows the world to be shaped, then that's one of the, to me, that's one of the original teachings that as a queer or two-spirit person, we can say, actually, our transness or transience is required for the world. So therefore, this method can be applied to other areas, right? Like, I think that that's the reason why I'm trying to think back to like the creation story as, and read it through a trans or queer lens, more likely a trans lens than a queer lens. So thank you for that.
I will say, try to quickly answer this. So there absolutely has been sort of like intersections with the idea of intersex in the language stuff that I've been learning about. And it's somewhat complicated by the fact that when you look at the archival sources, it's hard to say if the non-Indigenous translators just like didn't understand what, like, didn't understand the people that they were talking about when because they will sometimes use a term like hermaphrodite, for example, or if there is like actually like something in the language itself that is referring to like intersexuality. What I've kind of learned so far is my like sort of thought on this is that it does seem like there is a kind of reference, like the term Ayekwe that I was talking about can also seem to refer to like intersex people. And there's like a much more complex relationship then that like between, how do you like show the relationships between non-intersex two-spirit people and intersex like Ayekwe. That's like, I have a whole chart that I've made in Microsoft Paint. It's really it's ugly but wonderful. So yeah, that's just to say that there's definitely connections there as well.
Thank you so much again, Doctors Pyle and Pierce, for your wonderful presentations and for being willing to come out and speak on a Friday afternoon. Thank you to everyone for coming and for your questions. And everyone should be well. Take care.